And here is something I wanted to say. The topic, world literature, the dilemma for a humanities professor is something like this. On the one hand, who doesn't know literature? Who doesn't know the world? We all read, we cry, we laugh, we enjoy literature. But at the same time, it's also the subject for specialized study. The real problem is to kind of find the right voice to speak in. The humanities, humane, they are the stuff of life. So in that sense, they should not give professional light. But on the other hand, there's a bunch of us doing it as a profession. The whole question of finding a middle voice. So what I'm trying to do is share with you some of my own concerns, anxieties, dilemmas about the thing called world literature, both in my capacity as just a lover of literature, who loves language and words, but also in my capacity as whatever it is that I do as a professor. And also because world literature has been, for the last number of years, a heated theme for discussion and debate. People taking positions for it, against it. There's a whole range of issues around the conceptualization of world literature. So I'll share that with you, and at the end of that, please feel free to correct me, disagree with me, and share with me your own preferred positions on what you think the world is, what you think literature is, and all this stuff in between. I want to begin framing my talk with two little poems. One is from Kudambai Siddhar, one of the great Siddhar poets. And in Tamil it goes, Vetta Veli Tannil Meyyan Riraporku Patayam Edukadi, which roughly translated means, to those who live under the open, in the truth of their bodies, why would they need a certificate for residency? Okay. The second poem, I think both these poems really kind of showcase and perform some of the themes I want to share with you. And that is from the great Palestinian poet who died in 2008, none other than Mahmoud Darwish. And the poem is called Who Am I Without Exile? Here goes. A stranger on the riverbank, like the river, water, binds me to your name. Nothing brings me back from my far away to my palm tree, not peace, not war. Nothing makes me enter the Gospels, not a thing. Nothing sparkled from the shore of ebb and flow between the Euphrates and the Nile. Nothing makes me descend from the Pharaoh's boats. Nothing carries me or makes me carry an idea. Not longing and not promise. What will I do? What will I do without exile and a long night that stares at the water? Water binds me to your name. Nothing takes me from the butterflies of my dreams to my reality. Not dust, not fire. What will I do without roses from Samarkand? What will I do in a theater that burnishes the singer with his lunar stones? Our weight has become light, like our houses in the faraway winds. We have become two friends of the strange creatures in the clouds, and we are now loosened from the gravity of identity's land. What will we do? What will we do without exile and the long night that stares at the water? Water binds me to your name. There's nothing left of me but you. Nothing left of you but me. The stranger massaging his stranger's thigh. Oh, stranger, what will we do with what is left of us? Of calm, and of a snooze between two myths. And nothing carries us, not the road and not the house. Was this road always like this, from the start? Or did our dreams find a mare on the hill among the Mongol horses and exchange us for it? And what will we do? What will we do without exile? Well, it's a great poem, and I think you hear the way the word nothing keeps affirming itself time and again. And the peculiar positioning of exile, both as a position of deprivation, but as a fundamental basis for identity. And for a Palestinian talking about exile, well, on the one hand, seeking a nation state, and on the other hand, the very seeking of the nation state, making the nation state itself the problem and not the answer. And of course, exiledom begins to vibrate simultaneously as personal, existential, dialogic, me and the you, metaphysical, ontological, spiritual, planetary, all of the above, with all the contradictions and the incommensurabilities among the different levels. So more of this, and hopefully you'll tell me more from what you think of exile and what the nothing means to you. Okay, here I go. This is the real star. Let me see. So the real question is, there is the world and there is literature. So what's the big deal? The world has been as long as it has been, and people have been writing. So why suddenly convert it into a category called world literature? So the distinction between world literature as something which has always existed, as factual, expressive, phenomenological, and suddenly wanting to conceptualize it as world literature, and of course using the fancy within quotes. I come from a generation when I was doing my PhD, we had a disease called doing this. If you did that, you were going for profundity. And the small, you could say off and put that within quotation mark. The preposition would begin to teem with metaphysical meaning. So that is the first question. So is it a kind of a renaming of what already has been, available as an experience, and why do we conceptualize it? Is it a kind of to borrow from a great a friend and a colleague of mine who died recently, Meenakshi Mukherjee, who wrote Twice Born Fiction. So is it a rebirth? Is it a kind of a baptism? That something existed in a kind of a nameless way, but it was real, and then you call it something, and the act of naming confers on it a different kind of status. So it's a matter of recognition. So what was it like when it was world literature? And there's a tautology. I mean, there is the world and then the world literature. It has existed, and to call it world literature is really no big deal. So is it just an analytical gimmick, a professional move to create an object for study? So that's something to think about it. And also, if something has already, take for example, okay, there is Kannada literature. So what is not world literature? So if you read something and you think of it as Kannada, Telugu, whatever its local name might be, but now suddenly you also call it world literature, or you kind of, imposing on it a kind of a double consciousness. So it remains the same, but it really becomes a question of recognition from what point of view. And it's interesting, and one of the issues here has to do with what in philosophy you call the battle between nominalism and realism, or what you would call, what's in a name. A great example is the big battle between Gandhi and Tagore over civil disobedience, over saying no. They kind of love each other, the Mahatma and the poet, and they are in basic solidarity, but within the solidarity there are huge disagreements. And Gandhi always says, oh, come on, man, we really agree. And Tagore says, no, I actually disagree with you. And what does Gandhi say? The differences are purely nama-rupa, meaning they are merely modal, but they are not real. So think of it that way. So what is a modal recognition and what is the real recognition? So when the taxonomy changes, when the title changes, and what used to be, and suddenly somebody says, hey, I'm reading Girish Karnad. What are you reading? Are you reading Kannada literature? Are you reading world literature? Are you reading both? And how do you want to identify it? So the identification tag becomes a kind of a label. And then you're really wondering, am I one or am I the other? And I'll talk more about that later on. In the context of, the famous binary, the world and home, ghar and bahar, aham and puram, what is the home and what is the world, being at home in the world, are they mutually interchangeable? Are they, flip coin, side to the same coin? So keep that in mind. So the whole question of recognition, and again the question for whom, and the big question of who your audience is. And it's been a huge debate when you're writing. Do you write for yourself? Do you write for the other? Who the other might be? Do you write for a particular community? Or do you write for a world at large? The different degrees of assumed sharedness, of intimacy, different kinds of knowledges. One kind of knowledge, with or without using fancy German terms, is the kind of knowledge that is kind of local, intimate, organic, which you might call filial, filiative, natal, Gewenschaft and Gesellschaft, what the heck, I might as well say the words. The other is affiliation, which is connecting with things far away. And they become yours as well. And then you begin to wonder which intimacy is the real thing, which is artificial, which is undertaken for purposes of, of prestige. Can the two become? There's an interesting moment in, how many of you love Amitav Ghosh's fiction, or his writing in general? There's this fascinating moment in, he's a dear friend and an amazing writer. Have any of you read Gun Island, the book that he's just come up with after the Great Derangement in response to the call that he made? How do you write about the Anthropocene? But that's another story. So if you remember the shadow line, which I teach compulsively, this has to do with home and world. Who do you write for? The stranger. I mean, look at the word the stranger. Pardesi se na kya milana. Who the heck is the Pardesi? Both the near and the far. Sufi poetry, mystic poetry, using the name of the stranger as intimate, and this agonizing love for something which isn't near. So the whole thing has to do with binding a relationship, binding a connection. How do you name it? Do you not name it? That book, the very first page, the nameless narrator says something like, I'm telling a story about a family, but I do not want to reduce the importance of that story to the mere fact that they are family. So he's actually discounting a certain kind of natal blood and guts intimacy to say that he's doing something other. And that other could be, in the book it becomes a critique or it becomes a pro-secular book, but affiliation would of course be when you connect with people who are far away. And you read the same books, you read the same journals, you read the same, whatever. So that's a different kind of connection, which of course, if you can think of among many, many other writers, Tagore's own great novel, Ghar and Bahar, and the whole discussions in Partha Chatterjee's work, what is home, what is the world, and of course the great Ahamam Puramam. The Aham and Puram flip sides of each other. Or do you need to lose one to become the other? Do you transcend the one to become the other? What is your point of entry? Do you begin with home and you kind of move into the world kind of inductively? Or do you begin with something bigger and then deduce from the larger set the smaller? So these sorts of analogous movements. So keep that in mind. So I'm coming back to the notion of the same thing being looked at from multiple points of recognition. And for someone like me, born after India's independence, and here I am still, focusing on the question of the same object, multiple perspectives. One of the favorite schools of philosophy for me is phenomenology. And how many of you did a great poem by Wallace Stevens called 13 Ways of Looking at the Blackbird, that actually performs whether or not an object has permanence, and what does it mean to have a perspective. What does the perspective do, both to secure the permanence of an object, but in doing precisely that, disturbing it, and making it open for other perspectives. So I'm thinking of the famous speech, the canonical speech that Nehru makes. India is born, and at the tolling of midnight, we are born as a nation. Who was he speaking to? Was it a single audience? Was it to the sub-nation, the nation, the internation? It's an act of synchronicity. We are born as a nation. Aha, a name, nation. We were something, and again, Gandhi and Tagore say, and I'm sure people here who know languages may correct me, they say that in all the multiple languages in India, there isn't a single word which means exactly what the word nation means. So again, a question of we have existed, but we have now born as a nation. So is the act of baptism an act of violence? Is it an act of renaming? Is renaming a repetition of what already was there, or is it the inculcation of some principle which is not intrinsic to the literature itself? So that speech of his, so who is he addressing? The Dalit, the rural poor, the urbans, the subnational people, someone in Prague, someone in Berlin, someone in London. We have become a nation, which means we are inserting ourselves into a certain calendar, where we hope we'll be synchronous with someone else. So again, the whole question of how do we deal with multiple audiences, especially when they really are not synchronous with one another. And the other question is there a primary audience, and then a secondary, and then a tertiary? And which is your point of entry? And then how do you move from that to the next, etc.? So I'll come back to that in the context of the production of a category called the world, whose world, etc. So how am I doing so far? And again, at any point, please feel free to interrupt me with questions or comments. I'm more interested in a dialogue than in my just going on and on and on. So the question then is, why this sudden interest? Why don't just let the world be? The world is really already speaking and moaning and crying and sobbing and singing and dancing in millions of languages and dialects. So why the need to secure it as a world literature? Is it a kind of a intellectual hubris? And the question is, the real problem is this drive, purely academic? Who is talking about it and for what reasons? The person in the street, a common reader, a professor, a European, a Nigerian, and is it an attempt to make the word world seem suddenly evaluated, suddenly normative? The question is, if there is something called world literature, which seemingly inclusive, the question to ask, if you're psychoanalytic, is who is the other of world literature? Who is not in? So that the world can be what it is. You require an act of exclusion so that you can be who you are. Or you need somebody to be, the famous term by the great Italian thinker, Agamben, it's called to be included by exclusion. The moment is so long as the world literature, it's almost like, oh my God, don't conceptualize. That is the moment of terror. Just let things be. But the moment you say, I want to secure it as a world literature, suddenly you are creating a threshold of normativity. And you begin to wonder, it's almost like, I feel like saying it in some, now what else learn? Now am I in the world or not? What the hell? I was in the world already, and suddenly people are saying there's something called world literature. Am I in it or not? So what seemed like a natural act of possession becomes a theme of anxiety. And we can see how it is. We always think of it in terms of, we always say, in terms of scale. Is this literature local, ethnic, regional, vernacular, national? It becomes a building up of scale. And then it is of the world. And then you begin using criteria of scale, criteria of applicability, criteria of range, of comparatism, what you share. And in the process, certain literatures, like the production of national languages, the production of Hindi for that matter. How many kind of dialects had to be other so that you could have a national language? So suddenly this seemingly inclusive, emancipatory act of the world, want to include all, strangely becomes, rather than utopian, a dystopic kind of affair. Suddenly you are saying, my God, it's like saying, I'm now anxious. I thought I was in the world. What the heck? I'm not in the world now. And people think about it, how do I make myself non-local? How do I make myself broader, more cosmic, rather than be provincial, etc., etc.? So the question then is it ideological, is it interested, or is it disinterested? And I think you can read, for example, one of my very dear friend and the one and only, the amazing Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the debate between Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Achebe, they started writing post-colonial fiction, the same kind of question about who are you writing for? And Fanon, again, I know he's writing for Europe, and the whole question, and in particular, in the reality of a world, which is, to use the fancy term, but it really works, which is structured in dominance, which is asymmetrical, what does it mean, who's asking? And I think all I'm trying to suggest here is the famous question, hey, who's asking? It's a lovely American expression, meaning you're not being paranoid, but you really want to know, hey, what's your motive behind that? And this I want to link a little later to the all-important question of what would the difference be between, say, world economics, or world sociology, world politics versus world literature. Would you think literature is somehow, in some way, exceptional? Is literature not political? Is literature apolitical, so that anything done in the name of literature somehow exempts itself from the stigma of ideology, of interestedness? Okay, and more of that in the context of a small section where I will be contrasting two very well-known formulations of world literature, a different time period. One, of course, is Goethe, wealth literature, and the other is, of course, Tagore, Vishwasahitya. Very, very different visions in terms of how they build toward the notion of the world. And I think part of what happens there, and I will say it a little later, is whether we require the threshold called the political to achieve something called the world, or is the realm of the political itself an impediment? So that question has to do with the funny part of it is this: even though the world exists already, it has to be mediated to be known as the world. And then the question is, what will do it? Will it be love? Will it be sex? Will it be transcendence? Will it be the dollar? Will it be... So the whole question of a medium, and anytime you use a medium, no medium is innocent. It brings with it its own baggage, its own particularity. It still is a mediation. So it's like saying, the best example of that to me is Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim, Israel and Palestine. It still goes on and on and on. And then, heck, let's do it with music. Let's bring Israeli musicians, Palestinian composers, and do it the best we can in the hope that something called literature, even though it is trapped in the ugliness of political divide, is capable of some kind of transcendence. And Tagore believes in that. So we'll talk more about if you envision the world as a model, and literature becomes the modality through which you want to achieve it, and then we can talk about literature and languages. How would that way of conceptualizing the world, or making the world a world, different from, let's say, globalization through economics, or some kind of globalization achieved through some other modality? So what is so special, or not special, about literature, which is simultaneously something which is very general, and at the same time becomes available for modes of disciplinarization. Am I doing okay so far? Yeah, please.
Why do we need to define it?
May I have your name, please?
I'm Krish.
Hi, thank you. Yeah.
Why do we need to define it? Why don't we just let it be as is? Why do we need to put it under a gloss jar?
The thing is, as you said that, what do you think you did? That's the interesting question. And the moment you say that, the question is, say more. So do you think, would that be outside any parameter altogether? Would it be a personal speech? Or how would you sort of escape the world in which you live in? How would you want to make it amateurish, or would you want not to call it something? Say more about what's your sense of the way in which you yourself are either trapped by or enabled by the discourses you're part of, what's your feel, whatever that might be. So do you feel like you need to work against them, or do you think it's possible to kind of open up a space outside of all of these disciplinary, whatever, the enclaves of fiefdom? I understand your question. I don't have an answer. I'm struggling with you. So how do you produce an outside? Can you do it through an act of will? Will you say that certain ways of thinking? You could be, for example, a mystic, a Zen thinker who really says, thinking is really the problem. Any thoughts? Don't conceptualize and just let it be. Would that satisfy you, or?
Tell me in the end.
Okay. But I really appreciate, that's what I began with. Why call it, world literature? Is again about, a different thing. What little I know of some philosophies, look at people like Shankara, very problematic thinker, Nagarjuna, Zen Buddhism, the cogito, the thinking. What kind of an idiot are you to get a hold on to language? Or Nietzsche. Heidegger. The rules of language, grammar, what crap are you talking about? There's nothing called the subject verb. We say it is raining. Nothing is raining. It is raining, ging, 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 ging. We want to give it is raining. And it is called the anticipatory subject of the sentence. I mean, that's bullshit. What's happening is it's a becoming, and all these anthropomorphisms give you a sense of, as John Lennon would say, they help you get through the night. It's frightening as hell. It's not about you. But what the hell is it about? It's not about me, but I need to understand it. To understand it, I think, therefore I am. But that's completely Western. And then the cogito, the I, whatever. So I'm with you, but the question is, how would you, would you sort of stay within a field and deconstruct it? Or would you really say, I want none of this stuff, and create some other way of thinking and breathing? It's a great question. I would love to hear you say more about that. So I began by saying the humanities is a strange kind of a beast, where on the one hand there is the demand that it not be specialist, but the specialist in me says, hey, don't say fast. If you can allow physics and other fields to have their own discourse, the reason why humanities has its own jargon. And it's a different debate. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, please.
Are you saying that you can't define it?
Define what?
World literature.
It's being defined by whom and for what purposes. It can be defined, but the definition is never, what drives it. So when someone like Goethe says at a certain moment in time, we need something called world literature, what drives him to say that?
So what would be excluded from world literature?
The things that don't qualify. For example, in Goethe's sense, is world literature either Eurocentric, it is Afrocentric? What do you take for granted? What do you think deserves to be in it in terms of its value, in terms of its worth? It's an evaluation, and any evaluation by definition is exclusionary.
So it's very subjective.
It's not subjective. It is subjective to the extent that you assume certain standards, and you think the standard that you think, for example, in Goethe, all these discussions are about how within Europe things are being read within what's called Europe. And he, of course, he knew Kalidasa and Sanskrit, but the model that you build begins with the naturalizing of your point of entry. And you never get out of that. So you assume a center, and based on that center, you build a world. And the center itself becomes invulnerable. So I'm not saying that's how it seems to me worlds are constructed. The other thing to do is say, why even construct it? These things are happening, and people are talking and speaking in many different languages. Why would you want to unify? Why would you want to collectivize? This mad craze for something called the one, which you can either see as something good or as something pathologically monomaniacal. Pluribus unum. Why unum? Is the unum spiritual? Is it ontological? How do we know, are we one? If to be one, we need to be many. Which comes first? If we are just one, we wouldn't even know we are one. To know we are one, we need to be many. And if we are many, the real question becomes the distinction between the many having its own meaning versus cashing it in the name of the one. It's almost like what is value and what is a particular currency. And go to Marx for that. There's always value, but value has to be monetized. Somebody might say, I don't want to be monetized. I don't want to be in exchange. There is an intrinsic value that is prior to, he might have called it use value, or something prior to that. So that's where I'm coming at. So I'm not saying there's an answer. Of course, the other question is, if you're part of world literature, is calling something world literature a way of uprooting it from its own location? But if you, for example, say that the one world is already made up of many worlds, each has its own habitat, its own locality, and then suddenly you're being told, now I'm being made to, it's almost like saying, okay, I began with saying, is this Kannada literature or, world literature? You can either say, just for the very fact that something is in the world, it's already part of the world literature. It's obvious. If you wanted to go in that direction, what you would do with the literary scholar is use terms like selectively, part for the whole. metonymy. Quality stands for. But when you make the word literature, you bring in the ugly mechanism called representation. Someone speaks for somebody else. Whereas in the other case, there's no speaking for. The word is made up of so many languages. All of these things are part of each other. And they overlap. They come together. They're adjacent. There is no need to be part of something called the one. So my question really is, and please tell me if I'm wrong or if you think differently, my question is the production of something called world literature a kind of a manufacture? A kind of a raw material, and then you want to and then that's what I mean by saying, what is the connection between world literature and regional literature? What do you have to leave behind to be part of the world? What makes you part of the world? What if somebody, what if you're a Luddite, and he said, I want to be absolutely provincial. I want to hold on to my little world, and I have absolutely no desire to be part of something called world literature. Just let me be. Let me be. Don't deracinate me. Don't force me into connections and comparisons which violate who I am. So I'm just saying it can go either way. Or you sort of look for. So if you look at world literature, So I'm not saying how do you escape this mind. So for him, the whole logic is how do you go beyond the nation state. In West literature, the problem for Goethe is that, my God, people are within, and again for him, I'm not accusing him of, I think all of us in some way are racists. All of us have biases of all different kinds. He's writing out of a sense of insufficiency. He's saying, my God, here is something called German literature, and he actually says German literature has the capacity to become world literature. Someone else might say, why not Telugu literature? Why not some other literature? There's hidden hubris. And his sampling is very narrow. And if you think of it in terms of what Europe did to Africa, absolutely devastating it, created something called Africa, the Berlin Conference, then you begin to say, is this something modular? So are you creating like a modular kitchen, and the module travels everywhere? And the question is, somebody else might say, okay, your sampling is very limited, and for him, it becomes absolutely necessary that world literature is an answer to something called national literature. And something called the national becomes an absolute de rigueur. Without it, you cannot get to, which is why I began with Darwish. Exile, the nation state. What if somebody were to say, that particular way of getting into the world, that is not the path I want to take? Yeah?
So, I was just wondering, when you talked about Goethe, you were alluding to Goethe. It's just a digression probably. The German political sort of like the state emerged in the middle or towards the latter half of the 19th century. So you probably, what if it was that Sturm und Drang and like a lot of these German writers had this political project already, like Schiller, Goethe, Hölderlin, the poet, and what if that was the impetus? If there was this like national impetus, and in some senses, German nationalism has always tried to impose itself on the continent. While in India, as Arundhati Roy says, we try to shrink a continent into a nation state, right?
Yeah.
So maybe is that the reason why he was? No,
I don't have an answer. Please don't think. I'm as confused as all of you. I think we're confused in different ways. But for someone like a Tagore would say I find him problematic in a different way. He tries to avoid the political altogether. It becomes completely spiritual. And it becomes Krishna, it becomes Vrindavan, becomes Vishwabharati, and he said, it's a different kind of religion. For him, he almost wants to say this literature stuff bypasses the political altogether, which is kind of really eerie in a different direction. But the main thing, the thing about the problem is this: how do you succeed the trap of somehow not making yourself the center of imagining the world? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
You can be a point of entry. We all have to, we have to start somewhere. You as a German, me as a Nigerian, you as a lesbian, someone else. That's okay. But the point is, the moment you assume, you take the point of entry a little too seriously, and slowly, what was merely a point of entry becomes a center, and the center becomes centrism. And the question, how do you avoid that hubris? I have nothing, I love Goethe's work, but if you read all the definitions, for him, world literature is an answer to the poverty of nationalism. And once you say that, nationalism, people are thinking, what does it mean to different people? What does it mean to European? What does it mean to it? How did nationalism come into India? How did we have to become? And suddenly what seemed like an innocuous stage in a developmental history becomes a problematic issue. But it doesn't mean the same thing for something else. This is not to say that you shouldn't try it. The next time, if I didn't interrupt you, please go ahead.
The distinction you made between the universal and the regional literature that tries to aspire towards the universal. In some senses you mentioned Girish Karnad or for that matter, any regional writer.
Yeah.
There's a deeper humanism, right?
Sure.
So at some senses, wouldn't that qualify as world literature? Because the point being that I can read like a Lermontov in Russia, and I feel much closer to Lermontov than, say, a regional writer, who probably is writing about rural Karnataka or rural Kerala, for example. So, I'm just sort of...
I don't know. They're good questions. I don't know. So do you think any regional literature aspires to be world literature? I'm not so sure.
Universal at a deeper level in terms of humanism. Say Anantamurthy, for example.
Yeah.
Just because he's someone I've interacted with. He did talk a lot about nativism, but at the same time, he was well grounded in world literature.
Yeah.
And he talked about a deeper humanism. And so I don't know whether, these are slightly politically incorrect statements.
No.
Yeah, but,
please, I'm babbling all over the place myself. Please feel free to correct me. But the word human itself, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I don't know what the word human means to most of you. Is the word human political? If you are an African American, and I happen to be part of one of the most distinguished departments of African American studies, and there's a huge movement called, many of you might know, called Afro-pessimism. And two of its most vibrant exponents are two of my very dear friends, Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton. And what an African American pessimist says is, your humanism is horrible to me. Your humanism basically means it's called anti-black humanism. So if you are a human, you already are complicit in being anti-black. So I'm not even in your equation. So what seems to be a kind of very pious, benevolent, apolitical humanism is seen as the construction of the political. I want to come back to that. So I'm not quite sure what does the word political mean to you. Because some of the greatest of thinkers, it seems to me, are doing two things at the same time. Tagore is in different way. Fanon is. On the one hand, something called freedom has to be achieved as an outcome in the field of the political. That's what I'm saying. But at the same time, real freedom is freedom from the political. Let me say it again. So freedom in a world where there is inequality, it's a matter of the word freedom itself acquires its active meaning as a praxis. It's never given to you. So it's in the world of the political that you fight for, whatever your model might be. The dialectic, violent, whatever that might be. But at the same time, that's when you begin to think after a point, but can freedom be restricted only to the political? That's when you think of it in terms of I want to be free from the political itself. The great battle between the naysaying of Gandhi and the I-saying of Tagore. See, but Gandhi's, Tagore is telling Gandhi, man, you're really saying no all the time. You will never know what it means to say yes. And then Gandhi says, at this particular moment, I see you as a poet, you want to kind of bring your sitar to the party and talk about Ananda and things of that sort. But at this present moment, freedom to me is defeating the British. It has to be given a political currency. There are other forms of freedom, which are ontological, spiritual, metaphysical. So for someone like, if you're a Marxist, the whole idea for Marx was, how do you move from necessity to freedom? The moment the state will wither away. It might be that, or John Lennon saying, imagine no country, or what he called the sensuous totality of life. But how do you get to it? Through revolution, through the political. So it becomes part of a story of historicism, something called progress, the dialectic, contradiction, thesis, antithesis, and then going through various so-called stages. The stage called, accumulation, capital, industrial revolution, proletarian, the bourgeoisie, the nation state, the international. So that is a model of construction through political practice. Now that's a path which Tagore completely bypasses. He even has the gall to tell Gandhi, if you're really strong, He says, through an act of thinking, you can make it seem as if all of colonization was pure Maya. You could annihilate it. Because after all, it's only 250 years. And he says something fantastic. He says, if you keep thinking of freedom always as freedom from the British, freedom from the British, freedom from the British, your word freedom is always paranoid. The moment you say free, you say there's a different kind of freedom which is intransitive, which has nothing to do with freedom from. And the real question is, how do you kind of come? You see what I'm saying? And I think if someone like a Frantz Fanon, whom I absolutely adore, he's agonized with this. I'm stuck with this stupid game called the political. How the hell did I get stuck in it? So back to Afro-pessimism would say, hey, your humanism, I'm not even in it. How dare you presume my life began in chattel slavery? I was not even a person. So your humanism, I'm not in your blessed equation. My reality, for you to be human, you have to be anti-black. And if that is what constitutes your humanism, then my reality is not even in your equation. So again, it's a matter of the word humanism. I don't know how many of you think of humanism as ideological. Or is it possible to think of literary humanism as somehow exempt from the ugliness and contamination of politics, inequality? And that's what, for example, someone like a Tagore, and he would suddenly say Vrindavan. So when he says Vrindavan and Krishna, in his language, is it Hindu? Is it Sanskritic? Is it denominational? Or does it suddenly become nameless? So that becomes again the question of, in the attempt to think of a world, if you go into your tradition, Heidegger would go into all the way to the pre-Socratics and his magnificent attempt at kind of deconstructing all of Western civilization. Now, why? That's one tradition. So at that particular moment, is that Germanic or not? Then it becomes the question of, is the world just an open space? Which is why I began with the notion of the open. Is the world a name? Is it a noun? Is it a category? Is it part of a particular tradition? And what kind of translatability do we have between different traditions? And who presides over those kinds of translations? So that's, I don't know where I am, so I'm very happy to. Any comments, please? Yeah.
I had a specific question.
Yeah.
About,
Hi, what's your name?
My name is Usha.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you. So then does something become world literature when it's actually translated? And so does language become the currency for...
Please say, keep talking, it's fantastic. I would love to hear you say more. That's what I was saying. Seriously, please. Do you want to say some more? Because you opened up a whole area, which is the next part of my question of what does language mean? Yeah.
Question, which is, hi, my name is Gautam.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And related to Usha's question, which is, if it was in the language of currency, in English, I suppose today, can it not be world literature?
Yeah. So the real question is, the question of language, and I think that's where it was going. When you think of language as a metaphor, there's always people talking about the being of language and the language of being. Being speaks, does it speak in Sanskrit or Greek or Latin or whatever. So, but on the other hand, the world speaks in many languages. And if the world speaks in many languages, in certain traditions, the Tower of Babel, it's seen as a curse. In the Judaic tradition, my God, you didn't have a unity, I'm going to curse you into many languages, and then you can't. But it really depends on what the relationship is between the many and the one. And for example, we live in India, for God's sakes. How many languages and how many dialects? And they need to have a national language, and we'd always taught unity and diversity. So there the real question would be, even if you did say language, do you mean language as in a particular language? And that becomes implicated. Is it a vulgar language that is Sanskritic, Brahminic, non-Brahminic? So it depends on what you want to do with language. Do you think of language as something metaphorical, or do you actually want to think of it as something specific in the context of different languages sharing common ground? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I want to take I'm going to have another take on this.
Please do.
Because I think in the history of the world, if you can call it that,
Yeah.
our generation has benefited by so-called internationalism, globalism, and though we are heterogeneous, one thing that comes out, and to use humanism and how do you translate humanism, is coming back to put your quotes, the freedom. The freedoms and how we define these freedoms.
Okay.
If you take the rights language, you have your fundamental freedoms. Yeah? But if you take the literature, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom to think, which is again perhaps of a value that we underestimate, freedom to think. So now we have a kind of a denominator, in my opinion, to be able to say that we do have scope for world literature.
Yeah.
And wherever you are, whether you're in a ghetto or in a village, or you could still address these issues and have universal appeal. I know it's a large word, but to have universal appeal, so that you can share what you think to a wider audience.
Okay.
And I'm coming from downstairs in the auditorium. It's a very interesting thing where they're looking at the macro and the micro.
Yeah.
Where you take a Bharatanatyam performance and you're going to make it into a social media thing.
Mm-hmm.
So a 2-hour concert has to be made that first 3 minutes where the person will move to the next 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas we have the luxury of holding a book or a Kindle or whatever in literature to spare the time, and I don't know how much social media has disrupted, if that's the right word, this whole question of our luxury of reading and the world literature aspect of it. Then my last point, and then I'll shut up,
Please,
which is that we're in a library. And how soon do you see, I grew up with the John Dewey classification. I'm sure there are other classifications. Do you see a classification called world literature? I'm sure it exists.
Yeah.
And what do we put in there?
Precisely. Yeah.
You see, that's the other aspect, because this whole question of definition came up. And in order for us to refine the definition, I hate to use the word indicators or criteria. And what are those? And I'm sure you'll talk to us about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. You raised so many, really kind of intricate, interrelated questions. But I want to kind of, please have maybe a few more questions and comments, and I'd be happy to respond, and then we'll thank you for, please.
I'm Prashant.
Hi, nice to meet you.
To what extent do you think this category of world literature is really a product of discussions around the novel, the genealogy of the novel?
Yeah.
Because if you, even superficial knowledge of pre-colonial literatures, Sanskrit, Tamil, Persian, whatever, the category doesn't exist. There are notions of the world and there are notions of literature, Kavya, Sukhan, whatever, but there isn't a notion of world literature.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to emerge when you think of Marx's use of it in the Communist Manifesto as a metaphor for global capital and regional capital, right? So it emerges, even in its inception with Goethe and then Marx, as already structured unequally, as as sort of embedded in a kind of structure of hierarchy, right? Not symmetry. There's no question of Tamil and say, the Tamil novel and Baudelaire or Balzac being on par because of global unequal development, right? So the genealogy, it's not, So I think it's sort of, it seems to me like, and I have of course read your PMLA article on this issue, which is a wonderful essay, but it seems to me that it's really embedded in a specific genealogy of capital, and therefore colonialism as a kind of mode of capital, and what we're actually talking about is the novel, and then the free verse lyric, and then the retrojection of these categories onto the Rig Veda or Sangam poetry or Persian epics and so forth, which are then phenomenologically flattened out as epic or as drama or as literature in general, right? So you get an Northern anthology literature, which is a product of capital in a way, right? So I think I think one could play with these words endlessly, but I think what we're actually talking about is a specifically is a sort of concrete historical phenomenon that goes back no earlier than European mercantilism, 16th century and post-16th century.
That's a great, thank you so much for saying that. I mean, it's much better than I did. And I think the point that you're making is the category of something called the narrative. Narrative, a certain kind of historicizing, and actually people have written about that. Even the word history, has its particular origins.
There's Macaulay's famous assertion that even one bookshelf of
is worth more than
worth more than all the literature of Asia.
Yeah. Let me say a couple of things, and please take it over from me. This is much more fun for me. I'm responding to your question as well. So my question would be, I think that the distinction between what in my own work I've been calling relationality without recourse and something called the universal. One thing is to say that every existence is a coexistence. And we just don't exist. You can't even have a proper subject for coexistence. I mean, it means with. But that doesn't have to be clinched into the uni. So that's one way to go. The other way to go is to say, nothing wrong with, Goethe or anyone kind of coming up with a notion of a world literature, because you don't want the world. But here is a classic moment in feminist theory when Adrienne Rich, one of the most amazing, one of my heroes, heroines, writer, thinker, public intellectual, she writes a brilliant piece called Notes Towards the Politics of Location. That particular phrase has become huge. What is a politics of location? And she is addressing another heroine of mine, Virginia Woolf, who says, something like, a woman knows no country. And Rich says, Virginia, not so fast. I agree with you, but when you say that, you are not marking your location. You cannot say that because you are British. So you are a particular kind of person. So what she's insisting on is the tension between the location and what the location can say. But there's a certain lack of self-reflexivity, and that became huge. And Adrienne Rich, what is she doing? She's saying, oh my God, I have been absolutely Eurocentric. Meanwhile, there have been people of women of color, the Combahee River Collective, Third World Feminism. I haven't been listening to them. And she has a fantastic sentence that says, she gives her name, where she lives, I'm born, when was I born Jewish, was I born lesbian, was it a woman? And then she thinks, I thought I was at the center. And the fabulous sentence she is, at the center of what? Your center is nothing. The word center just becomes a location. And once you think of that, of course, each person has Ashish Nandi, who was a very problematic thinker for me in many ways, a great essay called Notes Toward a Third World Utopia. Imagine the utopia, but in the act of transcending, do not burn away the place from which you are attempting the transcendence. So the real message from Adrienne Rich of Virginia Woolf, in the context of what she was learning from women of color, was that make your statement, but don't make it in a kind of an oracular, disembodied way. Please mark your location. Who the hell do you think you are? And if you were to think that, the word nationalism takes on a very different meaning. Here is Ernest Renan in a famous lecture at the Sorbonne talking about what is a nation, which is fine. Renan was a brilliant thinker, philologist, but was he a racist? Absolutely yes. Was he ethnocentric? Absolutely yes. And while he is doing that, around the same time, there is the Berlin Conference, and what's called the Scramble for Africa. But Africa is invented as no more than an area for settler colonialism. The grab for Africa, Italian Africa, German Africa. And the absolute incompatibility between the Renan saying, looking for a spiritual principle, while at the same time, contemporaneous with that, Africa is being raped. Well, you got to think those two thoughts together. I'm not saying no one is exempt from that. It's happening even as we speak. The real question then is, the moment you there's some of the big debates happening, if you're doing world literature, do you forget where you come from? Or do you just, is the world somewhere else than where you're at? Or do you kind of combine the two? All of us are, but what about a term like relationality? Which means accepting relationships, coexistences of all kinds. Problematic, incommensurable, baffled, different kinds of. But in the whole world of the whole notion of, and there's something if we have the time, we can go back to the question of languages. Are there many languages? There are things like all roads lead to Rome. But who is Keshava in this? All roads. But why? Let me with this, I'm going to stop. And then please take over. So is anything one or is it many? Let me give you an example. I am more phenomenological than cartographic. By that I mean, if I reach a certain place, but I reach a place from different directions, the place becomes many for me. Which means I'm really kind of spatially challenged. The same place, if I come like this, or if I come through another way, it's still the same place. The real question is, when you have arrived at that path, have I transcended the particularity of the way by which I came? But if I still want to say, we have both arrived at the same point, but I still want to maintain the differential nature of how I got to it. So it is not the same thing anymore. It has to be negotiated. And I think someone like, various stories of, the one and the many, are you a dualist? Are you a monist? Or are you a Ramanujan? If it's a many, what if there were the many and there were no one? It's like phenomenology, a phenomena of what? But what if somebody said, you can go back to Shankara, you can go back to Nagarjuna, you can look at Immanuel Kant, there's something called, the thing itself, the in itself and the for itself. If there is something called a phenomenon, what is it a phenomena of? But what if somebody said, it's just a phenomenon, there's no of beyond. So there it becomes a question of negotiating between the legitimacy of the many and its relationship to some putative one. And someone the question then to ask someone like Walter Benjamin, who was an important thinker for me, he had the image of, the one having broken down. The many languages are fragments, and they need to be collected together. You can either say in the act of collecting it, you're trying to go back to a primordial unity that once was, or you might say there really was nothing before, that these are fragments, and if there is to be one, the one is to come. And not a nostalgic recuperation of something that was. But the more radical position is to say, why are you thinking of it even as fragments? What if they don't fit into a jigsaw puzzle? Or they kind of fit in, and they kind of jagged edges. And sometimes but they really don't need to, there is no obligation for the many to fulfill the truth of the one. Their job is to deny it, or to postpone it. It depends on how you want to read what the many is. So what are the many different languages saying? Are they saying the same thing? And there's a huge debate in academia of scholars taking positions on translation. Are things translatable or not? When do you want to be translated? And when is translation a misreading? And we can go on and on. Yeah, many, please, thank you for waiting.
So world literature is not a term that I use ever.
Yeah.
But I was wondering of looking at it as a safety net in a way.
I love that.
If we have like Perumal Murugan or Vivek Shanbag,
Absolutely.
And if the nation starts turning on its own, like they did with Murugan, in the meantime, do you have a larger network of solidarity?
Yeah.
So do you have, the fact that it's available in English also means you have a larger base of support until we can recognize our own.
Yeah.
So in a way, the international can save the national at times.
Absolutely. Do you want to talk more about that? About that, especially the network and what a network means. The same thing happened, for example, the whole debate about what is the transnational feminism. And which networks are you for, and which seem kind of artificially forced. So I'm not against translatability, but the real question is to kind of identify a common set of interests and then see how it works. Yeah, sure. Do you want to?
No, just starting a conversation.
Please.
I'd like to ask.
Yeah, please.
I don't need a mic. And also,
Please, could you use the mic though?
okay, will I be scolded?
Well, just wait a minute, please. Because it's recorded, so we miss you.
Just to take off from that point, when it does become translated and it enters this larger sphere of the universal of the world, also there's I don't want to mention names, but there is a discomfort that writers feel. And a very distinct feeling of having been taken out of context. And sometimes they have to make an extra effort to come back to, no, that's not what I mean, and I'm located in this firmly. And it starts sounding, for a lot of people, like being nativist, when in fact there is a very specific context within which he or she is having this conversation.
Beautifully said. So any thoughts about those sorts of issues about loss of meaning, translation that compared to to treason. Maybe I'll say just this. This is where it becomes very tricky. The word translation, traduce has certain meanings, but if you say anuvad in Hindi, it means that which comes after. All I'm suggesting is at a meta-linguistic level, even what the word translate means is different in different languages. In Tamil you say mori payarpu, which means mori is language, payarpu is deracination, being uprooted. And the same thing we say for the diaspora, pulam payarndavargal. The ones who, like me, who are not living in the country of their origin but living somewhere else, they have been. So the very word in Tamil, mori payarpu, allows deracination. They know it is, whereas in Hindi it is anuvad, which means that which comes after. But what comes after may either be, as in Lakshmana being Ram Anuja, is an obedient brother, or if you're a Derrida, and if you're a deconstructive thinker, partly which I am, the what comes after becomes what Derrida calls the dangerous supplement. The one which comes after to derail the legitimacy of what went before. To go back to what you said, it's not very clear. If you're saying I'm translating, then we get stuck in the linguistic thing. Hey, my God, even the word meaning translate means something in Hindi, something else in Tamil. What hell of a world are we in? We need further mediation about. And of course, you're absolutely right. When people insist on, the literature on that is huge, on saying, wait a second, I want to retain my local meaning, but don't call me a nativist. And I think he said it beautifully. That's a mischaracterization. It's too simple. But that's what it seems like. When do you how do you safeguard what sorts of networkings are simultaneously good for you, and at the same time, it's like it's entering a coalition. If I'm entering a coalition, do I become less than who I am? Or do I lose some part of me to be part of a larger collective? What is it in the coalition that persuades me that I need to coexist with that person? And that's a hard question, and that's where it seems to me, would most of you here say that something like economics is much more ideological, politics ideological, power game, asymmetry, control, dominance, hegemony, colonization, equity value. Whereas literature, my God, when we sing a song, whatever song it might be, at that moment we come together in a kind of an epiphanic, or do you say, wait a second, that's really not true. Literature is also ideological, but maybe it seems to you, and that's where someone like a Tagore would go, Sahitya, and he has his own, and after that he's just gone. And his vision of, the Vishwa Bharati, and Vishwa Sahitya have absolutely nothing in common. And as a matter of fact, and which is amazing, one of his earlier essays, Tagore has this beautiful statement where he says, he calls it the no nation people. He's clear, I despise nationalism of every kind, brown, yellow, white, spotted, any kind of nationalism, I don't really care. And nationalism is just a putrid way of dividing humanity.
But yet he gave us the national anthem.
Exactly. Those brilliantly said. Yeah. So we live in that kind of a contradiction, and he calls them the no-nation people. But it's easily said. But with Gandhi, I'm always torn between, but Gandhi said, no, you're doing it too fast. I get you, my dear friend, you want to sing, you want to say yes, 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 and Ananda is far away. But at this moment, this is the world where we're in. It's only by naysaying, it could be Nathi, or if you're, if you follow someone like, literature, Bartleby, the scrivener in Melville, who says, I prefer not to. So that becomes interesting, any of these formations. So when you are for world literature, what are you negating? And what are you affirming? And often the sad part of it is there may not be a coincidence between the negation and the affirmation. You may know what you're negating, but that doesn't necessarily lead you into what you are for. You know what you're against, but do you automatically through that glean, or through a kind of a deductive leap, say, because I don't like this, therefore, ergo, I like that, maybe yes, maybe not. And that's where it seems to me, many things we could talk about, and certainly language is a huge issue in what exactly, the one thing I would like to say is, and I'm sorry, please go ahead.
As promised, I think we can take a leaf out of Eliot, where he says all work exists simultaneously and together in a lattice or a matrix of sorts. So I think that's...
the moment in England, where everything comes together, yeah, okay.
It's just all work of literature exists together and relate to one another. And while we can get bogged down in semantics and say, I like this and I don't like this, I think fundamentally what's important is talking about it and communicating with one another so we can then arrive at whatever conclusion. Yeah. So I think semantics aside, talking about it and seeing how all these different pieces relate to each other from all over the place is what literature is about.
I think very good, and I think it follows up with what you said earlier on about. So for you, would something like literature be less of a system than something like economics, or do you think literature is a little more porous, open to conversation, less determined than other discourses? In your own personal, for example, do you write yourself, or do you write, in your own? Does literature seem a reliable vehicle than something else like, government, policy?
I think they all have its place, and they all are different tools that lend itself to the workings of the world in different ways. I wouldn't say they're quite so dissimilar, but they are individual and they are their own thing.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I hope I am not diluting this topic.
No, please, what's your name?
My name is Saroj.
Thank you. Please
So
take
what
your
I was
time.
wondering is, like if you can draw some parallel to the music.
Yeah.
And for a moment, let us say, if the music has poetry, and if the poetry has language,
Sure.
and if we take out that for a moment and focus on, let us say, something like instrumental music or Drupad music or something like that. Of course, Drupad also has language, but there are words.
Well, for the nature brothers passed away. It's
Yeah.
horrible.
And which has no no meaning, or if you look at Tarana, where there is no meaning, does that automatically become world music?
Yeah.
Or is it the fusion of multiple things becomes world music?
Yeah.
Or maybe somebody is having a folk tune, and then they are talking some words you don't understand, but it appeals to you. So I was just wondering, like, can we draw some kind of parallel with the music, world music and world literature, and can we kind of derive something out of it that gives us some solace?
Brilliant.
How do we go about world food for world cuisine? So I was just wondering.
No, that's phenomenal. Thank you for putting it. And which goes back to, So which goes back to the notion of semantics. So do you need to? How many of you have been following T.M. Krishna and the whole debate around, or the whole debate about bhava, or the whole debate about we don't really need words. Violin does something else. So really, the question is this: to be part of a larger conversation, do you need to desemanticize yourself? Do you need to unlearn something so I can learn something else? Or can they coexist? I just brought in T.M. Krishna as an example, and he's, I adore Carnatic music. My favorite forms of music, Carnatic music, film music, jazz, blues. On the one hand, he's an absolute purist. So when someone like Ilayaraja messes with Tyagaraja and does Mari Mari Ninne in Sindhu Bhairavi, T.M. Krishna says, crap, bullshit, you can't do this. He says, how come all of you people in Carnatic music didn't even say, and he loved Ilayaraja. But on the other hand, so he's a formal purist, but politically he's the other way. He's doing Guru Tamdil Perumal Murugan. Fantastic, Krishna, go. And he's de-Brahmanizing, de-hierarchizing music. But even as he's doing that, the question is, what do we want to hold on to? And what do we say is negotiable? And the word exactly, and if you're a linguist, it's always a question between syntax and semantics. Syntax elaborates. Syntax alienates the word. Semantics says, I'm a word by itself. No, you're not a word. You need to be in a sentence. And by definition, a sentence disseminates the semantic. The word can be taken in different directions, be implicated in multiple relationships, which are kind of oppositional, different, but the word says, I am both a word and a sentence, I am the word, I am the Lord, I am everything else, I am self-sufficient. No, you're not. You need to be in a sentence. But if you're in a sentence, you get alienated. There are rules of grammar. So in terms of that, I'm not sure. So the whole notion of, and I've got lots of things about fusion. I would love to hear more people. Let me say one other thing. Since you talk about languages, how would you say just like with existence and coexistence, is it a chicken and egg thing? Do they come at the same time? Who is the language for? If a language is not translatable, it is not even a language. So if you have huge, you read people like, the work in translation is huge. So you could either say, being and language. If being speaks, you think of it, why did even being speak? The moment you call it being speaks, you think of it as a language. And then you say, what is this thing called language? Is language anthropocentric? Or is it not anthropocentric? Then you say, if you are in language, and then you say, I am in language, but I am in Tamil. I am in language, but I am in German. Which comes first? But if you say, and Walter Benjamin's essay does a fantastic job of saying, he says, a translation is not meant for anybody. It's a brilliant move. To use fancy terms, he anonymizes language. And his idea is to prevent linguistic chauvinism. Any language is not meant only for itself, it is always meant for the other. If you are a language, and if you think that you're so goddamn self-sufficient that you don't need translation, then you're not a language. I remember we did a whole conference years ago, and the conference and the conference was titled "Translating America to Itself." So you don't presume that you know each other. So the real question is, so if you are in language, and think of someone like Sumati Ramaswamy's work on Passions of the Tongue. The great work, the Tamil people, they really said, I would kill myself for language. Language is more important than, so what do you want to die for? What marks you as who you are? And you were talking about, how do you name a festival? Do you call it, Kannada? Do you call it Karnataka? So where does your being lie? So think of it this way, if you say a language has to be both itself and has to be translatable, how do you manage the tension between a certain kind of protectionism on your own behalf? But then it's wait a second, if I'm a language, it's something called translatability that makes me a language. So I cannot, so that's a brilliant moment when, of course, Walter Benjamin says, he calls it the foreignness of all languages. But the question is, but it doesn't happen quite easily. So you have, on the one hand, the foreignness of all languages, and I'll give you a personal anecdote which I love using all the time. The great Jayakanthan, was a friend of mine. It was amazing. I translated some of his work. I still remember a particular day when somebody asked Jayakanthan, "Sir, neenga John Paul Sartre படிச்சிருக்கீங்களா?" I'll translate it for you. And Jayakanthan menacingly said, "Sir, neenga enna kekkureenga Jean Paul Sartre Jayakanthan படிச்சிருக்கேன். நான் உங்களை கேட்கிறேன், Jayakanthan வந்து Sartre படிச்சிருக்கிறாரா?" On the one hand, with a simple act of pique, you ask me, have I read Jean Paul Sartre? But has Jean Paul Sartre read me? A very legitimate question. But that's where the problem is. It's easy to say the foreignness of all languages, but we are structured in a world which is structured in dominance. So how do you negotiate a certain kind of what you might call, linguistic equity or distributive justice, but at the same time, not become self-sufficient and egocentric, and to draw. So if you are a psychoanalytic thinker, the word you would use would be self and the other. One is self and the other with a small o, the self and the other with a big O. The big O is the otherness, ananya. In front of that ethical responsibility, we all have the obligation to be strangers. All of us are strangers. So we need to create strangeness as the basis, alienation, defamiliarization, the way something that says, what do the English know of themselves? England happened overseas. If you know just yourself, the real question then becomes in the interaction between languages, how then do you sort of traverse the political terrain where you really want to redress these imbalances? But in the name of redressing those imbalances, don't fetishize your own language. Keep in mind that the foreigners of all languages, and it becomes a really very tricky game. But I would still come back to, the notion of the unum, and that's a complicated question. Is the world one or not? How do you say? Maybe you might say the world is one spiritually, but metaphysically, but not. Then it becomes a question of, do you want to sort of orchestrate them into a sequence? One, subsuming the other, like a bunch of concentric circles. In each circle it's concentric. Maybe it isn't even concentric at all. Maybe it's more like a Venn diagram, where there is a commonality, where you share something with another language. It's the whole part of you that is outside of the Venn identification. So you live both in the zone of identification as well as in the zone of differentiation. It's not one or the other, in which case it becomes relationality. Why the one? I am terrified of the one. That's my personal fear. The one, to me, is a scary thing. The one, to me, seems always like some machination to kind of unify. I think there are other ways of kind of sharing, giving, and in the sharing and the giving, you might say, hey, this isn't fusion, this is rape. This isn't hybridity, it's miscegenation. This is a free exchange of people loving each other, but this is not that at all. Given the variable history of humanity, where people have intermarried and many of them have been kind of happy and free, and many of them have not been. They've been the result of rape, and you say, no. So hybridity, the same thing with fusion, not so fast. Depends. Are you taking too much for granted? For me, fusion would mean, sufficient erudition in both fields. So it's a complicated matter. On the one hand, something in me loves pastiche, where you take things from different things, put them together. That's exciting as hell. But then on the other hand, I'm saying, who's doing it? And for what purpose? In doing this, is some tradition being completely misidentified, not being identified, recognized, then I would kind of shrink away in horror. But it's a complicated field where different criteria collide with one another, different evaluations, political, aesthetic, they're not all saying the same thing. Please.
My question might seem a little juvenile or infantile, but it's something that has been with me for almost 10 years, having studied world literature twice in my undergrad and in my postgrad. I want to go back to one of the things you said earlier. Is it a manufacture? Because what I observed through my education was world literature became a sort of etc. literature, right? We began our journey through the study of literature through area-based studies. Okay. So we began with British, and then we moved on to American, then we dabbled in little theory, and then we did Indian literatures, and then we did post-colonial studies. Then we moved on to thematic and political kind of discourses, like gender,
so it was
culture.
like a fruit salad.
Exactly. So this looked like it was all of these, let's say, Nobel Prize winners who were not British or American or Indian or post-colonial, put together into one paper. Right? Of course, so far the discussion has been fabulous, looking at world literatures as a discourse. But I'm more concerned about it as a discipline.
Okay.
Right? Because literature at the end of the day is a hegemonic practice. Right?
I'm in the heart of that business for me.
Absolutely. So, as located in the literature department, how does one really define what is world literature? When everything can be put into either a discourse-based discussion or, let's say, a location-based discussion. Even these questions of the world can relate to this idea. I'm writing from Bangalore, but this is relevant to the world. Right? All of those texts, every text we've studied, whether it's in British literature or American literature or Indian literature, finds its echoes in texts in other parts of the world. So is world literature some sort of collective conspiracy in departments of English across the world? Right? Because at the end of the day, we also need to accept that it is a very colonial practice. The fact that only if something is translated into English, and I'm not going to go into the problematics of translation, the fact that only if something is translated into English does it find itself in the world of world literature. So how do we define world literature? And if there isn't a definition, there's a discipline. As a discourse, it's beautiful. Is it worthy of being a discipline?
Well, if you call that juvenile, I've been infantile. No, it's a whole range of amazing questions. I can share with me my own confusions as I was growing up. On the one hand, John Keats was my brother. Okay? When John Paul Sartre died, I sobbed. On the other hand, there was a whole bunch of, there's no clear way of saying how do they meld together. Dostoevsky, my God, I mean, he's my, what do I say about Dostoevsky? I don't know, I can say spasiba, a few words thanks to my wife. But Dostoevsky, I live and die by him today. So what does that make me? I have no idea. I mean, had I not become a professional, and I'm delighted, I'm thrilled that that's what I love doing. Even if I had not done that, I think my sensibility grew responding to different people. But of course, at the later stage, you get into questions like, how did I get into this? Did I get into it? And you become little, is it a colonial influence? Did I read it through whose lenses did I read it through? Was it really mine? Was it someone else's? And I think those questions for me, they're important. I think you need to do both. It's almost like saying, what is this thing called tradition? Okay, let's say at a certain moment in time, I had my own quarrel with my own tradition. Brahmanism, casteism, patriarchy, misogyny. I was raging. Where do you go? If at that particular point, Bertrand Russell comes in, or a Sartre comes in and becomes a friend, is he a real friend? Then you begin to wonder, why did I go there? Did I need to go outside the fold? Could I have found answers within my own formation? So these are things that happen, but I'm very happy to be part of multiple, I don't need a pure origin. But all I'm suggesting is, first act is just reading, which is a need that you're in a certain situation. You're growing up in a certain family, and then you look around and say, what's my family like? And is it a good family, a bad family? What am I learning from my own family, the good and the bad? I think, home is both a good thing, but also can be homophobic. I think home, which is why I always talk about the first line in Nervous Condition by Tici Dangaramba, the first line begins with, I'm glad my brother died. What a horrendous thing to say. What a malevolent thing to say. Why is she saying it? Because she's in Zimbabwe, and her brother died, and her brother is a goddamn sexist. And had her brother lived, she would never have gone to school. So she's here saying, my own brother. It's the whole question of affiliation, where does that really belong? So you begin with reading, and some people you read. It might be Jazz, it might be Miles Davis, it might be Adrian Rich, it might be Keats or whatever. And then you put your world together, and then you begin to say, is this a melange? Is it a pastiche? Does it have coherence? What does coherence mean? Is it thematic? Is it ideological? Can a coherence be an ensemble? Or does it have to be coherence to begin with, right? Or is it a coherence you end up create through a juxtaposition? So you do two things, it seems to me, to answer to your question. One part of it is resolutely experiential. The other part of it is whether you become a professor of literature or not. I think all of us theorize in our own way. I'm saying something, we use some sorts of, ways of thinking, wherever you get it from your grandmother, from your folk tradition, we're already thinking through. So in that sense, we are, in a sense, discursifying. But the real issue is, borrowing a term from one of my dear friends, Hortense Spillers, what she calls the brush of discourse. When do you say the discourse falsifies your experience? So that would be the moment where the act of naming kind of changes things. Where, I'm using a term from Fanon, the notion of modularity, where the format becomes a coup. You're reading something, but you're constrained to call it a novel. You're going to call it something else. But then the format becomes a coup. So the moment of disidentification between what something really means to you at a visceral level and what your cogito allows you to call it. The great moment is in Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and he's agonized, moving between black and white and black and white. I think no more profound thinker than Fanon. And he says at one point, now that I'm decolonized, I'm discovering African rhythms, tribal music, and suddenly impressionism, because of all of that seems alien. But at the same time, but how do I call it? The moment between identification and recognition. Recognition, and suddenly, do I call it national literature? Do I call it culture? Do I call it custom? Back again to Gandhi and Tagore. Namarupa, and with Tagore altogether. Everything is in a name. What you call it is not just adventitious. What you call it gives it meaning. Do I want to call it Tirukutu, or do I want to call it Brechtian drama? All the difference. And that's where Fanon is agonized between, in a certain way, he would like to be quote-unquote, not primitivist, he would like to be African, But at the same time, the whole debate in finance studies, but do we want to call it custom? Do we want to kind of somehow align the content of my experience with a different form? And it goes back to something in you says, I want to experience this in a kind of a really anarchic and a disciplinary way. That's what I want to do. But in doing that, in a strange way, you create a discipline. And that to me is not a problem. I see it as a chronic issue. That's something all of us go through, experience formation. And you keep shuffling between them. And that, I think, is a very valid struggle. Okay, did I kind of get to your question at all? Yes? No? Yeah, please.
I still don't know what word literature is.
I'm sorry?
I still don't know what word literature is, and I like that you began with this idea. You said to form world literature, we have to make the other. So, what is the other of world literature?
No, on the one hand, the answer to the question is very simple. Anything in the world is world literature. But that seems like a tautology. But he's saying, you always say, but come on, man, you need to pass the test. What is the test? And all I was saying was nothing profound. Anytime you create a category, it has to be, it's against something what it's not. So that's exactly what you mean by saying, when you don't define, you feel like you are in it. The best example for that is Michel Foucault. He says, visibility is the trap. On the one hand, you want to be visible. But to be visible as a black person, if you're visible as a, oh my God, I don't need that goddamn stuff. I don't want to be visible. It depends what you mean by visibility. One kind of visibility emancipates. The other visibility makes you vulnerable to the gaze of the state. To some gaze that tells you that is who you are. So you can that makes sense. So in that sense, world literature, everything is in the world. So the poetry was in the world. But that simply saying, but is that too tautological? Do we need something more? It's like saying, this belongs, which means someone is saying gatekeeping. This makes the grade, the world, and not a kuti, the happy village or whatever. Unless the village itself is a world.
I think by our time, what we'll do is there are 3 hands up. We'll take your question and yours, and then they can answer all 3.
Please.
So mine is a simple point.
Yeah, what's your question? What's your name?
Vasanti.
Hi, Vasanti.
Yeah. Mine is a simple point. We are worried constantly during translation, when you read translated work, about the loss or loss of meaning. I think even in the primary or the text in your own language, when you read, there's always loss even then.
Absolutely.
And that loss also is it can be taken, should be taken seriously. So that's what I was trying to do.
It's a great question. I will respond to it by saying, how do you reconcile between a loss which is intra-identitarian versus inter? I'm sure to say there has to be loss for there to be meaning.
That's the
But you say, this loss I'm putting up with, whereas that loss I don't want to. That's the problem.
I think for me, language, the ontological condition of language.
Absolutely.
And so how can you not?
That's completely with you, 100% with you. Yeah.
This reminded me of what Jacobson says about how the infant can pronounce anything, any sound, but then loses it within a year. Anyway, so there's a kind of radical originary loss at the origin of language. I had a question different to this one. This is more a remark. I'm wondering if you're free to respond to it or not. But it strikes me that comparative philosophy, which is in bloom these days, in the world, doesn't seem to have this ontological problem about its object of inquiry.
Yeah.
You look at Canari's work, you look at J. Garfield, there's this assumption that East Asia, South Asia, and Europe, and parts of Africa, have philosophy, and that object is identifiable as such, and mutually translatable to an extent, and perhaps the translatability is anchored in a shared cognitive condition, kind of neurocognitive condition, which is the human condition. There's a kind of almost a biological basis, which allows for difference, but also translatability. Whereas, this ontological problem of whether there is such a thing in literature and whether there's a world literature seems peculiar to literary studies as a discipline. Which doesn't seem to obtain in the case of philosophy. It's just an observation.
No, I think it's a great observation. I don't know. I just want to make sure. I want to talk to you some more about that, please.
My name is Krishna Swami.
Yes, hi, sir. My name is Radhakrishnan.
I come from a very scientific background. So my interest in this topic is that world literature has come close a little bit. Technology being adopted by in so many conferences when one speaks and about it translated to hundreds of languages.
Yeah.
So I think it has played a big part in the world literature aspect. But whether one should know about the world literature or not is not so important, but if you can get all this technology coordinating all these efforts, then your requirement becomes much less of knowing the world literature.
No, I think, yeah, that's...
One last question.
Yeah, please.
And then we take it to the conversation.
Hi, I'm Sangeeta, and it's a very, very simple thing that who decides the quality of the translation? Because I have translated lots of Tagore songs, and Tagore himself has translated lots of his songs. So you would know that the whole world is getting to know Tagore songs through those translations, and they are getting graded, assessed by virtue of the power of the translation. Now, how does that sort of place the content over there?
I mean, Pratik, you should tell me. I mean, I want to listen to more people. How do we best use the time? And I'm always happy after that. I'm a party animal. Beyond that, I don't want.
I think we close and then take the conversation. But maybe you can respond to the three questions you have.
I mean, let me see. Again, I'm depending on what you mean by technology. I'm all for what you said, but I think there's also a need to see the limits of technology, where if it's mere instrumentality functionalism, I would balk a little bit. I think it's more than that. I mean, for me, someone like in the humanities, we are taught two things. On the one hand, instrumentality is inevitable, but at the same time, you need to kind of critique it. It's not just a matter of a policy, but there's more to it. So in that sense, I'm completely with you. And I think your question is a huge question. I think the thinking going on, especially in the context of epigenetics, in the context of, there's nothing unique about the human. There are things happening, at a different scale altogether. These questions may seem completely trivial, or in some sense anthropocentric in the most, factual sense of the term. But there are other kinds of, happenings going on at the level of language, sharing, or growth. So I think those questions of scale might make these questions seem, different. And back to your question, absolutely. And I think people translating their own works, Anandamurti, Tagore, etc. So I think I'm a big believer in betweenness. And to me, being between things is a very strong position. So if you ask me where do I live, I would prefer to say I live between 80 and 90 Murasaki Street rather than 70 Murasaki Street. The reason for that is to give you a horizontal sense of where I live rather than a pinpointed sense, right? Because it's easier, but you get crazy with me. Come on, man, tell me. I won't tell you. I'm somewhere there. I want you to locate me in a larger context. I don't want you to kind of get to me in a kind of a teleological, I got you, I reached you. Look around you. So I'm completely with you. So for me, I've been writing about betweenness. Betweenness for me is a great way of being accountable. But there's another debate when it comes to translation, and there's a whole movement by translators, like a union movement, saying, pay us well. We are trans creators. As a translator, you need to pay me. We are original in our own manner. So there is a way in which I like the idea of a translator kind of being both faithful to, but being adulterous. And in the act of translation, make the original seem less original. Because that becomes a matter of labor, you should also, why is the translator paid less? So that becomes a different issue of your reliance on an earlier text. Becomes hierarchical. So I think there are different directions. And in some sense, when you're translating yourself, who are you? So I'm all for those forms of questioning authority. But the real problem is, back to the example of Walter Benjamin, if you want to think of all language being foreign, the foreigners of all languages, there has to be trust. It's sort of like a suicide pact. Two people go together, one of them falls, the other person doesn't. What the heck happened? So every language should then commit itself to defamiliarizing itself. If some of them don't, then you feel like you were the idiot. Oh my God, I did all of this for you, and you didn't do that for me. And suddenly you kind of pull back. So that would be part, what would the world look like to me? To those kinds of commitments, that every location kind of insists on a certain kind of accountability, not just to itself, but extraterritorial accountability to beyond. If we can sustain that, then I think the world becomes a meaningful place. And really, I don't care a bit whether it's one or many. In the ultimate analysis, yay to the many. The one, to me personally, is a very threatening kind of way. And to make that the criteria, it's almost like saying, if you're, I mean, look, I live in the United States, the foreign language, oh my God, the whole, oh my God, second language intervention, multilingualism, that is dangerous. Are you kidding me? I mean, so there's another story, multilingualism, citizenship, nation state, sovereignty, the politics of paranoia. So that's what I will end with, in the name of Betweenness, in the name of the many.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.